Hello and welcome, Hero Forge fans. Once again, I am Dr. Faust of Dr. Faust Painting Clinic, bringing you another painting tutorial. In the first video, we went over the very basics of painting. We went over dry brushing and washes, which that'll get you to a certain place. That'll get paint on the miniature. But this time, we're going to go over something much more important. We're going to go over layering. Layering is the process of using multiple semi-transparent layers of paint to apply the highlights to your miniatures, as opposed to a bit more crude way of dry brushing. It's simple in explanation, a little bit difficult to master, but once you figure out how to thin your paints properly and apply them properly, well, there's almost nothing you can't do when it comes to miniature painting. So I hope you're ready to learn, because this one is really important, and let's just get into it. So layering is the process of using thin transparent layers of paint to apply highlights to the miniatures. The amount of water you want to use per drop of paint varies. To start off with, a 1:3 paint to water ratio is good. I normally use 1:5. You can adjust that based on how much time you want to spend on the miniature versus your end result. So it also varies a little bit depending on the type of paint you're using and what it's being applied over. So thin your paint to a good ratio. Like I said, if you want to just, for the beginning, you can start off with a 1:3. What we've created here is basically a wash, and if we apply it directly to the miniature, it's just going to run everywhere. We're not going to have any control of it. So you need to take your loaded brush and wipe it back and forth a couple times on a paper towel, and then you can apply it to the miniature. If you have the right amount of moisture on the brush, you can tell because the paint should dry in about 10 seconds. And if there's too much moisture on the brush, you also notice when you pick the brush up, you'll see a little drop of excess paint right where you pick up the brush. I should note that I'm using this figure just as an example to show you how thin the paint is when it's applied. Normally, you wouldn't be layering over a straight white base coat like this. The key with layering is that you don't just put one coat of paint on the miniature. You put one layer down of that color, and then that same color you put another layer down, and another, and you slowly build the color up until you get to the point of diminishing returns. You can see on the back of this guy's jacket here, I put one coat on the left side, and then two coats in the center, and then I did a third coat on the right, so you see how much more intense the color becomes, and you can see there's almost no brush strokes. So let's begin painting our fire wizard. Gonna go for a slightly darker red color for his robes, and I like to start with the darkest color and work my way up. For our dark shade color here, I have a mix. It is Vallejo model color black red mixed with some model color royal purple. The royal purple is to add a little bit more richness to the red. I should point out here, this is the first layer, so we are not actually layering yet. The paint is slightly thin, but we don't have it thin to that 1:5 or 1:3 ratio. For our next shade, I've mixed in some Vallejo model color 926 red into the mix, and we are just starting on the layering process here. Once again, the paint is not super thin because that dark recess color, we want to keep it just in the deepest recesses and like the edges essentially, and there's not a whole lot of edges on this figure, so this paint is going to go over in about 2 coats, 2 layers, as opposed to some of the other areas that we're going to paint where we may paint up to 5 or 6 layers. Finally, we work up to our base color, which is straight 926 red. And by the way, I use the term base color a little bit differently than some people. Some refer to it as the first color applied to the miniature. I refer to it as the overall unifying color in the middle of our shades and our highlights, the basis of what our shades and highlights work off from. So we are now applying this, and we are finally working on straight layering here. And you can see in the upper right hand corner, hopefully, how thin our paint is. And we are applying just coat after coat after coat. So we slowly go around, apply the highlight in the proper areas, and we just move around the figure. Remember that I said that the paint should dry in about no more than 10 seconds. And also, if you pick up your brush and you have a little wet spot there, you know there's too much moisture on the brush. So go back to your paper towel and give the brush a little wipe to absorb some of that excess moisture. And here we are towards the end of the process. It's been roughly 5 minutes. I've gone around the figure about 5 times, adding layer after layer after layer over the red. And we can finally stop when we get to the point where we don't get any return from our highlight here, when applying another layer doesn't make any difference. So that's the point where we stop and then apply the next lighter color. And if you can tell by doing this, our thin layers, we don't have any brush strokes to see because it's a transparent brush layer going over another one. It kind of creates a, it sort of ghosts the edge of where your brush gets applied, because each time you put down the brush, it's not the exact same area. So you get a nice smooth feather blend throughout your highlights. Now we start working on the highlights for the miniature, and we are using Vallejo model color Carmine red. The same process that we did with the other red, except for it's in a smaller area. We concentrate towards where the highlights would apply. So as we apply each highlight layer, we start working, for example, towards that raised knee, the top of the shoulders, the tops of all the folds on the robes, any place that would be more likely to where the light would hit. And it's because we want that contrast. We want the deep colors in the recesses and the lighter colors on the highlights. One thing I should point out is when I talk about thinning your paint, I mentioned about 1 to 3 or 1 to 5, maybe more. It really depends on a lot of factors. It depends on, once again, how quickly as opposed to how much quality you want in your paint job. Also the color that you're applying, the color that it's being applied over, many factors. Reds, for example, tend to be very transparent by nature, so they don't need to be thinned as much as other paints. So I'm actually using a mix here of about roughly 1 to 3. You can usually tell just by eyeballing it how thin I want it. So that's a real rough measurement. But we are proceeding to highlight like we did before, just layer after layer until we get to the point of diminishing returns. To the Carmine red, I have now added some Vermillion and proceeding to work our way up to the lighter highlights. You can see we're applying the paint over a much smaller area, and so the process gets a lot quicker as you work your way up. And also, if you're worried about applying too many coats of paint on the miniature and having that obscure the details, because the paint is actually being applied so thin, that's of little concern here, because we are pretty much just applying colored water at this point. So by the end of this process, each one of these folds can have 30, 40 layers on top of it, and you're not going to be able to tell. Our final highlight is straight Vermillion, and this time we're fluctuating the layering a little bit because we want to apply this on a few of the broader areas where we want a bit more of a highlight, like the knee I'm doing right here, and also some of the very edges of the folds. In those broad areas, we still want the paint thin, but in where we want a sharp edge painted, that we want the paint a little bit thicker so we have more control over it. So maybe only 1 to 2 thin ratio or something like that. This is actually a 2 issue painting guide here, because not only are we going over layering, but we're also going over red, which is a difficult color to paint because of the transparent nature that I mentioned, and also red is a little bit difficult to highlight. Without knowing better, some people add white to it, but that turns it pink, and also you can highlight it with yellows, but it tends to kind of bleach it out. If you want a really rich red, you can just stick with lighter red colors for the highlights, or you can mix in a flesh tone works as well. But the main key is you don't want to overdo it. Keep your highlights subtle. With that, the robes are done, and it's time to move on to the skin. I decided to go for a slightly darker skin tone for him, and I put the first shade layer down of Vallejo Model Color Camo Medium Brown, and now I'm applying the second shade by mixing some Cork Brown into the medium brown. Of course, there's a wide variety of skin tone colors that you can use, and most manufacturers have pre-mixed colors, but you can mix a lot of your non-flesh colors. Just because it doesn't say flesh on the bottle or skin, you can still use that as a flesh color. And throughout this series, I'm going to try to do a slightly different skin tone on each figure to give you an idea of some different things you can try, because experimentation is one of the things that helps you really improve as a painter. Next comes our base color, which is straight Cork Brown. And this is actually a good example of how I was explaining on the last step of the robes, where you want your paint a little bit thicker, where you want it thinner. On the crown of his head, for example, I want the paint a little bit thinner because it's a larger surface. I got to blend those colors so they slowly transition through the highlights. But on like the fingers, I want the paint a little bit thicker because I don't want to make a mistake and have that color accidentally flow into the recesses because they're so very small. So you need to be able to adjust how thin your paint is based on what you're painting. To the Cork Brown, I've now added some basic skin tone and proceeding to work up towards our upper highlight areas. And once again, working on the areas where we want to make more pronounced. So he's a bald guy, we gotta really highlight the crown of that head, and also we're working our way towards the upper areas of the cheeks, definitely the nose. We want to make the chin a bit more prominent, and the upper lip, and of course on the fingers we start working our way towards the knuckles, so we make those digits more pronounced from the back of the hand. And then finally we finish off with just straight basic skin tone. And as before, you can see how long it took to paint those first few layers, but as you quickly apply all your highlights, you start working on smaller areas, so the process speeds up. So while it might seem a bit daunting to paint a huge area in the first couple steps with layers, painting over and over and over, the process does get quicker. For the cape and some of the trim areas, we're going to go with violet because that is a really good color. It works really well with reds. And I've already undercoated with a mix of black and violet red, and now we are using straight violet red. And once again, the paint is thinned. Exact same process we used on the skin, exact same process we used on the robes. Just thin layers repeated over and over to slowly build up the color. I think I already said, me explaining layering, it's very simple. It's thin layers of paint. That's all it really is. It's simple to explain. It's a little difficult to master because you, on your end, need to figure out how much to thin the paint and also where to apply those colors, those highlight colors. So this might sound a little bit repetitive, but it kind of is. Layering is just it is repetitive on its own, essentially, layer after layer after layer, but this is examples of it. So I hope these examples work and you eventually can do this on your own. To the violet red, I've now added some Warlord Purple, and once again proceed to add our next highlight layer on the robes. Darker colors, it's kind of a personal taste. I don't like to over highlight darker colors because then they're not dark, but some people prefer a more, shall we say, vibrant style to their highlighting and highlight everything up to almost pure white. So you can do that if you wish. That's just not the style of painting that I employ. I go for more muted colors and smooth highlights rather than very stark, overly heavily contrast. But as I said, it's part of experimentation. That's part of getting better at painting. So if you want to go up to straight pink here, you possibly can do that. And then our final highlight color, straight Warlord Purple on all the small, super raised highlight bits. You may be noticing that I'm using a very obvious way of highlighting here with the colors. We start with the violet red, mix in Warlord Purple to the violet red, then we use straight Warlord Purple. So it's an obvious 100%, 50-50, then 100% of the next color. If we were to go to highlight this more, then we would go with like 50% of pink or whatever color you have, and then for after that would be 100% of that color. So that's a very easy way of figuring out how much to highlight. Sometimes it won't be 50% though. Sometimes it'll be 70 and 30 or 80 or 20. Again, that's the whole part of the problem with mastering layering, is figuring out how much of the highlight color to add and how much to thin it. Let's move on to his little flaming skull spell he's doing there. Decided to go with green because that would contrast well with the red that we used in the robes, and base coated with game color Escorpena green, and to that I have added white for the highlights. I want this to be a bit more over contrast because this is like a magical spell. This isn't a physical object that we're highlighting here, so we can go a bit more extreme here. And actually I've already highlighted once. This is the second highlight, adding more white to it, and I believe I worked all the way up to just pure white, but it was only about 3 highlight colors. Next we apply a thin glaze of yellow ink. Now what is a glaze? A glaze is basically, it's same as an ink wash, but it's much thinner, and it's also applied much more caringly, much more like the layering we did on the robes or the cape. The purpose of it is to add a tint of color where we need it. In this case, I want to tint the white a little bit yellow and also add the yellow color to the green we just did. And it makes for a really nice, subtle, transitional color that, well, it's basically a tint. That's the best description for it. But you can apply it to slightly alter the color of something you've already painted without repainting it. In this case, I'm applying it because the tint tends to give a slightly different type of highlight. For lack of a better word, I'm going to say slightly ethereal, but that's not a great example. But after applying this and letting it dry, then we apply a green wash in the recesses. Okay, we're getting into the home stretch now. The last thing I'm going to show you how to paint is his belts and the arm wraps. For that, I've base coated with Beasty Brown, and now I'm applying a highlight color of game color Desert Yellow. When it comes to, once again, these small areas here, we don't have to do the same thing we did on the robes. These thin, small areas, we could just highlight about 3 times is enough. I think I used 3 here. I might have used 4. I kind of lose track when I'm painting. But we don't have to go over and over like we did with the robes. We can have our paint a little bit thicker and keep it the layers a little bit down in number. Then for our final highlight color, game color Plague Brown. So that makes 3 colors that we used: the Beasty Brown, the Leather Brown, and the Plague Brown. And then we finish off with an ink wash. It's a mix of black sepia mixed with some glaze medium. Just because we learned how to layer doesn't mean we're going to throw out dry brushing or ink washes. While layering is better, in some situations a wash is better. In this case, there's some deep recesses here on the belt that I want to emphasize, and also on the arms. There's some extremely fine edge work on all the wraps, and trying to pick those out highlighting normally is going to be really difficult, so instead we use a wash. And we don't apply it over the whole area, which we can do, but I don't want to darken it too much. So instead we just kind of work it in towards the recesses, and then on the bottom area where we want a little bit more shade, that area we can spread it out a bit more and put it on just like a layer or a glaze. Final thing to do is the robe trim, and for that we're using some yellow ochre. And once again, very small area. We don't have to do 5 layers here. We can just do it in 2. I picked the yellow ochre because gold colors work very well with reds. However, we already used gold on that huge necklace he has and on the scepter. So we don't want to use exactly that same shade of gold, but using a yellowish kind of gold color would work well here because it also would balance with the belt and the arm wraps. So we want a slightly different color than that. So that's the reason why I'm trying to explain to you why I pick certain colors. Throughout this series, I'll try to explain what color that I use, the reason behind it, because I know some people have a problem trying to figure out how to balance your colors well, but that's the logic in this situation while I'm making it this yellow ochre. And then finish off with just a single highlight with white added to the yellow ochre. Like I said, there's no real reason to put 5 layers here. Also, there's no real reason to have the paint super thin. This is the part of mastering layering, is know when to thin your paints and when not to thin them. Well, correction, I should say you always thin your paint, but it's to the degree of how much you thin them. So hopefully throughout this video, that's the whole idea that you've gotten. And with that, we are done with our red robe wizard with his green flame. So, as I said at the beginning, this video, if you watch this whole series, however long it's going to be, this video I would say is probably the most important. After watching this, I hope you go back and watch it again and practice layering. Because, as I said at the beginning, if you can master layering, it opens up so many doors. Because it teaches you how to thin your paints, it teaches you how to properly apply your highlights. And because you can thin your paints, you'll know how to properly mix up washes and glazes and all sorts of different techniques that you can use. It's, like I said, it's easy to explain, a little difficult to master, but the important things is just keep your paint thin and also wipe it on that paper towel so you have control over the paint. That's the 2 steps. And just practice. Start working on your highlights, figuring out where the light falls on a miniature, what area should be in shade, what should be highlighted, but practice it. Keep working at it. It's not going to come to you right away. It's going to take quite a while for you to figure out exactly the right ratio to use, but using this method, I think it's a lot easier to learn how to highlight than with wet blending. It's much more forgiving. If you put one transparent layer in the wrong place, it's no big deal because it takes those multiple layers to build up and intensify the color. But you can see here, you don't see any brush strokes, do you? I hope you don't. But came out pretty well, and it's all just very thin layers of paint and knowing where to apply them. So as I said, watch this video, watch it again, and maybe watch it a 3rd time, but most importantly, practice. And I will see you again very soon, but seriously, watch this one again. Next time we'll go over something a little different. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.